The wind in Bitter Creek, Wyoming, had a voice of its own. It was not a gentle whisper or a mournful song. It was a dry, rasping thing that scraped across the plains and carried the taste of dust from 1,000 lonely miles. It rattled the loose boards on the general store, spun the ungreased axle of the blacksmith's sign, and moaned through the canyons like a lost soul searching for a grave it would never find. The town itself was little more than a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled together for comfort against the vast, indifferent emptiness of the land. Fences strung with taut wire stretched to the horizon, their posts leaning like tired old men against the ceaseless pressure of the wind. This was a place built on grit and necessity, where hope was a luxury and survival was the only prayer that mattered. For Clara Mae Thompson, that prayer had gone unanswered. At 19, she had already learned that the world was not a kind place. Her life had been one of hard work and small joys on her father's farm, a patch of stubborn soil that had finally surrendered to drought and debt. Now, the farm was gone, and so was her future. Her father, a man broken not by the land but by the ledgers, had made a deal to save what was left of his pride. He had sold the only thing of value he had left, his daughter. The groom was Harlan Pike, a name spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence in Bitter Creek. He was a land baron, a man whose ambition was as wide and unyielding as the territory he claimed. His sprawling ranch, the Double Horn, controlled half the valley, its fences swallowing up smaller homesteads and its cattle grazing on land that others had bled for. He was a man in his late 40s, with a face carved from granite and eyes the color of a winter sky, cold and distant. He did not want a wife, he wanted a possession, another piece of property to adorn his empire, a testament to his power. Their wedding took place in the small, stark church at the edge of town. There were no flowers, no music, only the droning voice of the preacher and the relentless sigh of the wind outside. Clara stood at the altar, a ghost in a simple dress her mother had made years ago. Her skin was pale, stretched taut over her cheekbones, and a tremor ran through her hands that she could not still. Her eyes, once the color of a summer cornflower, were hollowed out, dark pools of despair that reflected nothing. She did not look at Harlan Pike. She did not look at the preacher. She stared at a crack in the wooden floor, focusing on it with a fierce intensity, as if it were the last solid thing in a world that was dissolving around her. The townspeople filled the pews, their Sunday best smelling of mothballs and soap. They whispered behind their hands, their words carried on the drafty air. "Lucky girl," one woman murmured to another. "To be chosen by a man like Pike. She'll want for nothing." They saw the transaction, not the sacrifice. They saw a poor farmer's daughter elevated, not a young woman condemned. They could not see the cage descending around her, its bars invisible but stronger than steel. When the preacher declared them man and wife, Harlan's hand closed around her arm, his grip hard and proprietary. It was not a gesture of affection. It was the act of a man taking ownership. He turned her from the altar, and as they walked down the aisle, the whispers died, silenced by the cold authority that radiated from him. No one met Clara's empty gaze. It was easier to look away. Outside, a sturdy wagon waited, hitched to 2 powerful black horses that stomped impatiently, their breath clouding in the cool air. Harlan did not help her into the seat. He lifted her by the waist and set her down with a thud, his movements efficient and devoid of any tenderness. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and with a sharp crack of the whip, they jolted forward, leaving Bitter Creek and the last vestiges of Clara's old life behind in a cloud of swirling dust. The journey to the Double Horn Ranch was a silent one. The landscape grew wilder, the plains giving way to rolling hills and jagged outcrops of rock. The ranch was even more remote than she had imagined, a fortress of solitude nestled in a valley carved by a river that ran swift and cold. The main house was a massive structure of dark timber and stone, 2 stories high with a wide porch that seemed to scowl down at the valley below. It was a house built not for comfort but for dominance, a reflection of the man who owned it. Barns, corrals, and bunkhouses were laid out with meticulous, almost military precision. Everything was orderly, functional, and utterly without warmth. As they pulled into the yard, a dozen or so ranch hands stopped their work to watch. They were hard-looking men, their faces weathered by sun and wind. They touched the brims of their hats in a gesture of respect toward their employer, but their eyes slid past Clara. They saw the tear tracks on her dusty cheeks, the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she flinched when Harlan's hand brushed her back as he guided her toward the house. They saw it all, and they looked away. They knew Harlan Pike. They knew his temper, the quiet cruelty that lay beneath his controlled exterior. They depended on him for their wages, for a roof over their heads. To interfere, to even offer a look of sympathy, was a risk none of them were willing to take. Their silence was a wall, and Clara was on the other side of it, alone. But one man did not look away. Leaning against the far side of the corral, partially hidden in the long afternoon shadows, was a cowboy named Eli Dawson. He was not like the others. There was a stillness about him, a quiet intensity in his gaze. His face was leaner than the others, marked by the sun but also by something deeper, a history of pain that had settled into the lines around his eyes. A faint, silvery scar cut through his left eyebrow, a permanent reminder of a past he never spoke of. He had been with Pike for 2 years, keeping to himself, doing his work with a grim efficiency that even Harlan respected. Eli watched the scene unfold, not with the detached curiosity of the other hands, but with a dawning sense of unease. He saw the way Pike held the girl's arm, as if she were a prisoner. He saw the hollowed-out look in her eyes, a look he recognized from another lifetime, from a face he saw only in his darkest dreams. It was the look of someone whose spirit was being methodically extinguished. He saw her stumble on the porch steps, and Pike's hand tighten on her, his fingers digging into her arm to steady her. It was a small, quick movement, almost imperceptible. But to Eli, it spoke volumes. Something was deeply, horribly wrong. He pushed himself off the fence, his jaw tight, and turned back to his work. But the image of the pale, trembling girl with the haunted eyes was burned into his mind. The house was as cold inside as it was imposing outside. Dark, heavy furniture stood like silent sentinels in rooms that were vast and echoing. A stern-faced housekeeper named Mrs. Gable showed Clara to her room, her instructions delivered in a clipped, emotionless tone. The room was large, with a 4-poster bed and a window that looked out over the endless, rolling plains. It was a gilded cage, luxurious and empty. This was to be her world now. The days bled into one another, each one a copy of the last. Harlan treated her as an extension of his will. He expected her to be silent at the dinner table, to manage the house under the watchful eye of Mrs. Gable, and to be available to him in the dark emptiness of their shared bed. He did not speak to her of hopes or dreams. He gave her orders. His presence was a constant, suffocating weight. When he was home, the ranch was a silent battleground of tension. When he was gone, riding the far edges of his property, the silence was different, a hollow, lonely ache. Nights were the hardest. After Harlan was asleep, his heavy breathing filling the room, Clara would slip out of bed and go to the window. She would stand there for hours, wrapped in a thin shawl against the chill, and stare up at the sky. The Wyoming sky at night was a breathtaking spectacle, a spill of diamonds on black velvet. So clear and close you felt you could reach out and touch them. She would trace the constellations her mother had taught her, finding a fragile comfort in their familiar patterns. The stars were constant. They were free. She thought of running, the idea a frantic bird beating against the inside of her ribs. But where would she go? Back to her father. Who had sent her here? Back to Bitter Creek, where the townspeople would judge her and send her straight back to her husband. The fences of the Double Horn were not just made of wire. They were made of power, money, and the unwritten laws of a harsh land that offered little mercy to a woman alone. The vast, empty plains that stretched out from her window were not a path to freedom, but a wilderness that would swallow her whole. There was nowhere to go. The realization was a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. She was trapped, as surely as a coyote in a steel jaw. It was during one of these bleak nights that the first small act of kindness appeared, as she quietly unlatched her bedroom door to slip into the main hall for a drink of water. Her bare foot brushed against something soft. She looked down. Folded neatly on the floor was a thick wool blanket, warmer and heavier than any she had in her room. It was one of the rough blankets the ranch hands used. There was no note, no explanation. She looked down the long, dark hallway, her heart pounding. Had someone seen her shivering by the window? For a moment, fear coiled inside her, the fear of Harlan finding out, of his rage. But then, another feeling pushed through. The blanket was an acknowledgement, a wordless message that said, "I see you. You are not invisible." She quickly gathered it up, took it back to her room, and wrapped it around her shoulders, its rough texture a strange and welcome comfort against her skin. A few days later, it happened again. She had taken to walking in the small, walled garden behind the house, the only place she felt a sliver of privacy. The water from the house pump was often brackish, with a metallic taste she had never gotten used to. As she sat on a cold stone bench, she saw it tucked behind a rose bush, a metal canteen, the kind a cowboy would carry. She picked it up. It was full to the brim with cold, clean water, sweet and pure, likely from the hidden spring up in the hills that only the long-serving hands knew about. She drank deeply, the coolness a balm to her dry throat. Like the blanket, it was an anonymous gift, a silent gesture of compassion in a world that had shown her none. She did not know who was leaving these things, but the mystery was less important than the meaning. Someone saw her pain. Someone cared enough to try and ease it, even in these small, secret ways. A tiny, fragile seed of hope, one she thought had been crushed forever, began to stir within her. She started to look for signs, for a face among the ranch hands that held a flicker of sympathy. Most of them still avoided her gaze, their faces impassive masks. But sometimes she would catch him, Eli Dawson. He would be mending a fence line, or tending to a horse, and for a brief, unguarded moment, his eyes would meet hers across the dusty yard. He never smiled, never gave any outward sign that he was the one, but there was a depth to his gaze, a quiet understanding that passed between them in those fleeting seconds. It was in the way he watched her, a silent sentinel at the edge of her lonely world. She began to suspect it was him, and the thought, as terrifying as it was, brought a strange warmth to her chest. But she was not the only one who noticed the change in the air. Harlan Pike was a man who missed nothing, especially on his own land. He noticed the new blanket she kept folded at the foot of her bed, a blanket that did not belong in his house. He noticed the faint, almost imperceptible easing of the tension in her shoulders. He saw the way her eyes would sometimes drift toward the bunkhouse, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. He was a possessive man, and his property was behaving in a way he could not account for. His suspicion began to curdle into a quiet, simmering rage. He started watching her, his cold eyes following her every move. His questions became sharper, laced with accusation. "Where did you get that blanket?" he demanded one evening, his voice low and dangerous. "It was cold. I found it in a storage chest," she lied, her heart hammering against her ribs. He did not believe her, but he let it go. For now. His jealousy, however, had found a focus. He began to watch his men with a new intensity, his gaze sweeping over them, looking for a sign of insolence, a look of pity directed at his wife. The air on the ranch grew thick and heavy with unspoken threats. The kindness that had been a secret lifeline for Clara was now becoming a danger. The silent battleground of the double horn was poised on the edge of a storm, and the first rumble of thunder was the sound of Harlan Pike's growing, menacing wrath. The news came on a Tuesday, carried by a rider from Bitter Creek whose horse was slick with sweat and dust. It was delivered not to Clara, but to Harlan, who received the sealed letter with an impassive nod. He read it in his study. The door closed, and emerged a quarter of an hour later. He found Clara in the kitchen, mending one of his shirts, her needle moving with a mechanical, lifeless rhythm. He dropped the letter onto the table beside her. It lay there, a stark white rectangle against the dark wood. "Your father is dead," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "Collapsed in the street yesterday. The doctor said his heart gave out." Clara's needle stopped mid-stitch. The world seemed to tilt and then fall silent. The only sound, the frantic, muffled beating of her own heart. Her father, the man who had sold her, the man whose weakness had condemned her to this life, was gone. For a moment, she felt nothing, a hollow numbness that was colder than any winter wind. Then came the grief, a terrible, tearing wave of it, so sharp it stole her breath. It was not a simple grief for a loving father, but a complex, ragged sorrow for the man he once had been, for the life they had lost, and for the final, absolute severing of her last tie to the world she had known. He was the only family she had left, and now he was gone. The faint, foolish hope she had secretly harbored, that one day he might realize his mistake, that he might come for her, died in that instant. The last door had closed, and now she was truly, irrevocably alone. A single, choked sob escaped her lips. Harlan watched her. His eyes narrowed, clinical and cold. He saw her grief not as a wound to be soothed, but as a vulnerability to be exploited. He let her cry for a moment. Then his voice cut through her sorrow like a whip. "There will be no theatrics," he said. "You are a pike now. You will conduct yourself with dignity. This changes nothing." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "In fact, it simplifies things. You have no one now, no one but me. Remember that. Remember who provides for you, who owns you. Any defiance, any hint of the foolishness I have seen growing in your eyes, will be dealt with severely. Do you understand me?" His threat, delivered in her moment of most profound loss, was a cruelty so deep it felt like a physical blow. It shattered the last fragile pieces of her hope. She could only nod, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, despairing sobs. He had taken her grief and twisted it into another chain to bind her. In the days that followed, a change settled over Clara. The quiet despair that had haunted her eyes deepened into a flat, empty resignation. She moved through the house like a ghost, her steps silent, her presence barely a whisper. She did her duties, spoke when spoken to, and retreated into a shell so thick that not even the vast, lonely landscape seemed to touch her. Eli Dawson saw it all. He had grown accustomed to watching for her, his day punctuated by the brief, distant glimpses he might catch of her in the garden or through a window. He had seen the rider from town, had seen Harlan's cold expression afterward, and had watched as the light in Clara seemed to gutter and go out. He began to notice other things, too. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry on the line, the wind pressed the sleeve of her dress against her arm, revealing the dark, unmistakable shape of bruises on her wrist, marks that looked sickeningly like the imprint of a man's fingers. He saw how she flinched when Harlan's voice rose unexpectedly, a quick, involuntary jerk of her shoulders, the reaction of a creature long accustomed to pain. He saw the quiet resignation in her eyes, and it tightened something in his chest. It was a look he knew too well. He had seen it in the eyes of a doe trapped in a hunter's snare, a wild, beautiful thing that had fought until it had no fight left, waiting now only for the end. He knew that when the fight goes out of a person, the soul begins to die, and he had sworn to himself, over the small, unmarked graves of his wife and son, that he would never again stand by and watch an innocent suffer if he could do something to stop it. His secret acts of kindness, the blanket, the canteen of water, now felt like hollow, useless gestures. They were not enough. Weeks turned into a month. The autumn air grew sharp, and the sky took on the gray, heavy look of impending winter. The tension on the ranch was a palpable thing, a low hum of violence waiting to erupt. Harlan's watchful suspicion had not lessened. It had sharpened, honed to a fine point. He missed nothing. Then the storm came. It rolled in from the north, a great dark wall of clouds that swallowed the mountains and turned the afternoon to twilight. The wind rose to a furious howl, tearing at the roofs of the barns and sending dust and debris skittering across the yard. A cold, hard rain began to fall, driven almost horizontally by the gale. The ranch hands scrambled to secure the livestock, their shouts lost in the roar of the wind. Harlan had business in Bitter Creek that day, a meeting with a cattle buyer he could not postpone. He stood on the porch, pulling on a heavy slicker, his face a mask of irritation. "I will be back before morning," he said to Clara, his voice barely audible over the storm. "See that the windows are latched." He did not say goodbye. He simply turned, strode to his horse, and rode out into the teeth of the gale, a lone dark figure quickly consumed by the sheeting rain. For a long while after he was gone, Clara stood at the window, watching the storm unleash its fury on the land. The world outside was a churning chaos of wind and water, and for the first time in months, it felt like a perfect reflection of the tempest inside her. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge, a desperate need to feel something, anything, other than the cold, dead numbness that had become her existence. She needed to feel the rain, to let it wash away the grime of her sorrow, if only for a moment. Without thinking, she unlatched the back door and stepped outside. The wind hit her like a physical force, tearing the pins from her hair and whipping it across her face. The rain was shockingly cold, soaking through her thin dress in an instant. She kicked off her shoes and walked barefoot into the yard, the thick, cold mud squelching between her toes. She tilted her head back and closed her eyes, letting the torrent wash over her face, plastering her hair to her skull, streaming down her neck. It was a baptism, a violent, cleansing release. Tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks, hot against the cold, and she sobbed freely, her cries swallowed by the storm's magnificent roar. For the first time since her father's death, she was not silent, she was not resigned. She was simply a girl, broken and weeping in the heart of a storm. Eli had been in the stables, checking on a mare about to foal, when he saw the back door of the main house swing open. He saw Clara step out into the downpour, a pale, ghost-like figure against the dark wood. He watched, his heart lurching, as she walked into the mud, her head thrown back, her body shaking with sobs. For a moment, he was frozen, caught between the need to respect her privacy and the overwhelming urge to go to her, to offer some kind of comfort. The sight of her, so utterly alone and consumed by a grief that the whole world seemed to share, decided for him. He pulled his hat down low and walked out into the storm. The wind tried to push him back, and the rain stung his face, but he kept his eyes on her. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. When he was only a few feet away, he stopped. She had not yet seen him, lost as she was in her own world of sorrow. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low but clear enough to cut through the din, "you should not be out here. You will catch your death." Clara's eyes flew open. She gasped, stumbling back a step in the slick mud, her arms coming up to cross over her chest. It was him, the quiet cowboy with the sad eyes. In the gray, stormy light, the scar on his brow seemed more pronounced. I am sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling with cold and shock. "I just needed some air." "This is a whole lot more than air," he said, his expression gentle. He took a half step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Please, Mrs. Pike, let me help you back inside." They stood there for a long moment, the storm raging around them, the wind whipping her drenched dress against her legs. They were in their own small bubble. The rest of the world washed away. For the first time, they were not separated by a dusty yard or a pane of glass. They were simply a man and a woman, standing together in the rain.
"He is gone,"
she whispered, the words barely audible.
"My father, he is gone."
Eli nodded slowly.
"I know. I am sorry for your loss."
His words were simple, but they were spoken with a quiet sincerity that touched her more than any flowery condolences could have. He was not just speaking words. He felt them. She could see it in his eyes. "It was you, wasn't it?" she asked, her voice still a whisper.
"The blanket, the water."
He did not deny it. He simply held her gaze. "A person ought to have a warm blanket when it is cold," he said softly, "and clean water to drink." It was all the confirmation she needed. A fresh wave of tears welled in her eyes. But these were different. They were not tears of despair, but of a profound, aching gratitude. "Why?" "Because I know what it looks like when someone is hurting," he said, his own voice growing thick with an old, familiar pain. The rain began to lessen slightly, the roar of the wind softening to a mournful moan. They stood in the mud, talking, their voices soft, as though they were afraid of being heard by the wind itself. It was as if the storm had created a space for them, a temporary sanctuary where the rules of the double horn did not apply. "I wanted to be a schoolteacher," Clara confided, the words spilling out of her as if a dam had broken. "I had books. I loved to read. I wanted to teach children their letters, to see the world open up for them. But my father, his debts," she trailed off, the story hanging unfinished in the damp air. Life had taken everything from her, even the simple dream of who she was meant to be. Eli listened, his gaze unwavering. When she fell silent, he spoke, sharing a piece of his own brokenness, an offering to match hers. "I had a wife," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Mary, and a son, Samuel. He was only 4 years old. We had a small place down in Colorado. The fever came through one winter. It took them both in less than a week." He looked away then, his eyes focused on a distant, painful memory. "I buried them myself, on a hill overlooking our homestead. After that, I just started writing. Never stayed in one place too long." He looked back at her, his eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. "I could not help them. I swore to God I would never let another innocent soul suffer if I could do anything at all to help." His confession settled between them, a truth as raw and powerful as the storm. Their separate pains, his and hers, met and mingled in the cold, wet air. They were no longer just the master's wife and a quiet ranch hand. They were two people who had lost everything, who understood the landscape of grief. A bond, forged in shared pain and silent empathy, solidified between them. Stronger than words, deeper than a passing glance. She saw the man behind the scar, and he saw the woman behind the fear. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with a new, unspoken understanding. He saw her shiver, her body racked with a sudden chill. "We need to get you inside," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched, not to grab, but to offer. And that is how Harlan Pike found them. He rode into the yard at that exact moment, having turned back because of a washed-out bridge. He was soaked and in a foul temper, and the sight that greeted him sent a bolt of pure, unadulterated rage through him. He saw his wife, disheveled and mud-streaked, standing entirely too close to one of his hired hands. He saw the man's hand reaching for her. He saw the look that passed between them, a look of intimacy, of shared confidence, that he himself had never received from her. He was off his horse before it had even come to a full stop. "What is the meaning of this?" he roared, his voice like a crack of thunder that had nothing to do with the storm. Clara gasped and shrank back, her face a mask of pure terror. Eli immediately straightened. his body instinctively moving to place himself slightly in front of her.
She was unwell, sir,
Eli said, his voice even and calm, betraying none of the sudden tension that coiled in his gut. I was helping her back to the house. Harlan's eyes were blazing. He did not care for explanations. He saw only betrayal. He strode toward them, his boots sinking into the mud. "You will not speak unless spoken to. Dawson," he snarled. He turned his furious gaze on Clara. "And you? What did I tell you about defiance?" He raised his hand, the back of it poised to strike her across the face. Clara flinched, her eyes screwing shut, bracing for the inevitable blow. But it never came. In a movement as swift and sure as a striking snake, Eli stepped directly between them. He did not raise his own hands to fight. He simply stood there and took it. Harlan's fist, intended for Clara, crashed into Eli's jaw with a sickening thud. Eli's head snapped to the side, but he did not fall. He planted his feet in the mud and absorbed the blow. Harlan, blind with rage, struck him again. A brutal punch to the gut that drove the air from Eli's lungs in a pained grunt. "Stop!" Clara screamed, her voice thin and desperate. "Please, stop!" Harlan ignored her. He hit Eli again and again, pouring all of his suspicion and jealousy and fury into the blows. Eli took the beating without a word, his body absorbing the punishment meant for her, his eyes, when he could focus them, fixed on Clara, silently telling her to stay back. Finally, his rage spent. Harlan stepped away, breathing heavily. Eli swayed on his feet, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth and from the scar above his eye, which had been split open, but he was still standing. His defiance was silent, but it was absolute. Harlan pointed a trembling finger at him. "Get your things," he hissed, his voice dangerously low. "I want you off my land by sunrise. If I ever see your face again, I will kill you." He grabbed Clara's arm in a vice-like grip and began to drag her, stumbling and sobbing, toward the house. "You," he growled at her, "will learn what obedience means." Clara looked back over her shoulder one last time, through her tears. She saw Eli standing alone in the rain and the mud, his face bruised and bleeding, watching her being dragged away. He had saved her, and in doing so, he had condemned himself. The storm outside was finally passing, but inside the dark house of the Double Horn, the real tempest was just beginning. Sunrise painted the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Eli Dawson stood by his saddled horse, the cool dawn air a sharp sting against the raw, swollen flesh of his face. His jaw ached with a deep, throbbing rhythm, and the cut over his eye had crusted with dried blood. He took one last look at the main house of the Double Horn, a dark silhouette against the growing light. A single lamp burned in an upstairs window, her window, a tiny, defiant star in the vast, oppressive darkness. Every instinct screamed at him to ride hard and fast, to put this cursed valley behind him forever, but he could not. The image of Clara being dragged away, her terrified eyes looking back at him, was a brand on his soul. To leave now would be to abandon her to the wolf. He swung himself into the saddle, his movement stiff with pain, and turned his horse not toward the open plains, but south, toward the winding path of the Bitter Creek River. He followed its course for a couple of miles, until the ranch was out of sight, hidden by a series of low, rolling hills. There, in a small clearing sheltered by a grove of cottonwood trees, he made his camp. It was not much, a bedroll, a coffee pot, and the few possessions he owned tied up in a canvas sack. But from the edge of the clearing, if he climbed a small, rocky outcrop, he could just see the distant roof of the Pike homestead. It was enough. He would not abandon her. He would watch, and he would wait. For Clara, the days that followed were a descent into a new kind of hell. Before, she had been a possession. Now, she was a prisoner. Harlan confined her to the house and the small, walled garden. He dismissed the young maid who had helped with the chores, leaving Clara to the silent, watchful judgment of Mrs. Gable. Her husband's temper, always a dangerous undercurrent, had become a volatile, unpredictable force. The public humiliation of Eli's defiance had wounded his pride, a far graver injury to a man like Harlan than any physical blow. The silence in the house became her tormentor. It was a heavy, listening silence, thick with Harlan's rage. He would watch her for long, unnerving stretches, his cold eyes dissecting her every movement, searching for any sign of rebellion. His punishments were no longer swift flashes of anger, but calculated, cruel torments designed to break her spirit. He would deny her meals for a misspoken word, lock her in her room for an afternoon for an imagined look of insolence. He was stripping her down, piece by piece, trying to erase the woman Eli had seen in the rain and replace her with a compliant, broken shell. The story of what had happened in the rain-swept yard spread like a grass fire. Ranch hands, with their loyalties divided and their tongues loosened by whiskey in the saloons of Bitter Creek, talked. The story twisted and changed with each telling, but the core elements remained. Soon, the entire valley was whispering. They spoke of Harlan Pike's pretty young wife, the girl with the haunted eyes, who seemed to be slipping into a silent madness. And they spoke of Eli Dawson, the quiet cowboy who had worked for Pike, a man who, they said, must have lost his mind to have so openly challenged a man like that, all for another man's wife. The whispers painted Clara as a troubled, perhaps unfaithful, woman and Eli as a fool or a homewrecker. The narrative protected the powerful and condemned the weak. And every rumor that drifted back to the double horn was another log on the fire of Harlan's fury. Clara heard the whispers in the averted eyes of the few ranch hands she saw, in the tight-lipped disapproval of Mrs. Gable. She was being tried and convicted by a jury of strangers, and her prison walls, once just the fences of the ranch, now extended to the edges of the entire valley. There was no escape. She thought of Eli, wondering where he had gone. She prayed he had ridden far away, that he was safe from the poison that had seeped into this land. The thought of him being safe was the only comfort she had left. Weeks later, on a cold, clear night when the stars seemed close enough to touch, disaster struck. A dry autumn and a careless spark were all it took. A fire broke out in the largest of the barns, the one closest to the bunkhouse, where hay was stored for the winter. It started small, a flicker of orange in the darkness, but the dry timber and mountains of hay were perfect fuel. Within minutes, the flicker became a roar. From his camp by the river, Eli saw it first. He had been sitting by his small fire, staring into the flames, his thoughts, as always, on the woman in the house on the hill. Then he saw it, a growing, unnatural glow against the night sky in the direction of the ranch. He shot to his feet, his heart seizing in his chest. Smoke, thick, black smoke was beginning to billow into the air, illuminated from below by a terrifying, dancing light. Without a second of hesitation, he threw his saddle on his horse, his movements urgent and sure. He did not think about Harlan's threat. He did not think about the consequences. He thought only of her. He spurred his horse into a desperate gallop, riding back toward the hell he had been banished from. By the time he reached the ranch, the scene was chaos. The main barn was fully engulfed, a roaring inferno that spat embers into the night sky and threw terrifying, leaping shadows across the yard. Men shouted, their voices thin against the fire's roar. Horses trapped in the nearby corral screamed in terror. Ranch hands ran back and forth with useless buckets of water. And Clara was there, in the heart of the danger. She had been woken by the shouts and the red glow filling her window, but as she fled the main house, she heard a sound that chilled her to the bone, a child's terrified scream coming from the direction of the fire. It was Thomas, the stable boy, a skinny orphan of about 14 who often slept in the tack room of the barn he was meant to be tending. Without a thought for her own safety, she ran toward the flames. her mind fixed on the boy trapped inside. She found Harlan near the corral, his face pale and slack with panic in the flickering firelight. He was not organizing the men or trying to save his property. He was staring at the flames, mesmerized by the destruction, his mind seemingly paralyzed by fear.
"Thomas is in there!"
She screamed at him over the roar.
"We have to help him!"
Harlan looked at her, his eyes wide and uncomprehending, then back at the barn, from which a wave of heat so intense it buckled the air was now pouring.
"It is too late,"
he stammered.
"The whole thing is coming down."
He took a step back, away from the danger. He was saving himself. It was in that moment of stark, ugly cowardice that Eli rode into the yard like a vengeful spirit, his face grim, his eyes wild. He leaped from his horse before it had even stopped, his gaze sweeping the scene, instantly taking in the situation. He saw Clara, her nightgown illuminated by the flames, and he saw Harlan, backing away.
"Thomas!"
Clara cried, pointing a trembling finger toward the barn.
"He is trapped inside!"
Eli did not hesitate. He ripped a bandana from his neck, soaked it from a water trough, and tied it over his nose and mouth. "Stay back!" he yelled to Clara, his voice a raw command. And then he ran, head down, straight into the maw of the burning barn. For a terrifying minute, there was nothing. The men stopped, their buckets forgotten, and stared at the doorway through which he had disappeared. Clara stood frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Harlan watched, his fear momentarily replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Then, just as a section of the roof groaned and began to collapse, Eli emerged from the smoke and flames. He was half carrying, half dragging the coughing, soot-covered form of the stable boy. He stumbled out into the yard and collapsed to his knees, laying the boy gently on the ground as he gasped for clean air. But he was not done. His eyes, raw and red from the smoke, found Clara's. He saw the way Harlan was looking at him, not with gratitude, but with a murderous rage. He knew with absolute certainty that he had just signed his own death warrant. Coming back was an act of defiance. Saving the boy was an act of heroism. But in Harlan's twisted mind, it was all part of the same betrayal. And now, Clara was caught in the middle. He staggered to his feet. "We have to go," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not bruising. "Now." "What?" she asked, her mind reeling from the smoke and the fear. "Go where?" "Anywhere but here," he said, pulling her toward his horse. "He will kill us both." Harlan seemed to snap out of his stupor. "Dawson!" he bellowed, his voice shaking with fury. "You are a dead man. She is my wife. You will not take her." But Eli was already swinging Clara up onto his horse, then mounting behind her. He held her tight against his chest, kicked his heels into the horse's flanks, and they plunged into the darkness, away from the fire and the shouts, leaving the burning heart of the Double Horn Ranch behind them. They rode hard into the hills, the acrid smell of smoke clinging to their clothes, the light of the fire slowly shrinking behind them until it was just another angry red star in a black sky. They rode until the horse was trembling with exhaustion and the moon was high overhead. Eli finally drew them to a halt in a deep, hidden ravine, where the sound of a small waterfall trickled nearby. He slid from the saddle and gently helped Clara down. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she would have fallen if he had not caught her. She was shaking, not from the cold, but from the shock of the fire and the terrifying flight. Her nightgown was torn and blackened with soot. He led her to a shallow cave he knew of, a dark slash in the rock face, sheltered from the wind. He settled her on the dry ground, then built a small, smokeless fire just inside the entrance using skills he had honed over years of living on the run. The small flames pushed back the oppressive darkness and offered a fragile warmth. Clara huddled by the fire, her arms wrapped around herself, but the shaking would not stop. She looked at Eli, his face illuminated by the firelight. His hair was singed, his face and hands were covered in soot, and a fresh burn marked his forearm. He had risked everything, had ridden back into the fire. For her, and she had brought him nothing but ruin. She was a curse. "You should have left me," she whispered, her voice a broken, ragged thing. "He will hunt you down. He will kill you because of me. Please, just go. Leave me here and save yourself." Eli knelt in front of her, his expression weary but resolute. "I am not leaving you, Clara, not now, not ever." "But you do not understand," she sobbed, the tears she had held back finally breaking free. "There is nowhere for us to go. He owns everything. The law, the people, they will all be on his side. We will not survive this." Her despair was a bottomless pit, and she was falling into it. She had been passed from one man's cage to another's protection, but it all ended the same. There was no escape, only a slower or faster death. A terrible, weary resignation settled over her, heavier than any sorrow she had ever known. She looked at him, her eyes hollow in the firelight, her spirit utterly broken. The fight had finally gone out of her. She reached out and touched his bruised cheek with a trembling hand. "Take me instead," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. The words were not a plea for passion, but a plea for an end, an offering. "Let the world take her. Let him take her. Let the wolves come. Let it be over. I do not care anymore." Eli's face filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to break his own heart. He saw the depth of her despair, the final surrender in her eyes. He gently took her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her soot-stained fingers. Then he leaned forward, his movements full of a reverence that bordered on prayer. He did not kiss her lips. He pressed his mouth to her forehead, a kiss that was not of lust, but of sorrow and unwavering devotion. It was a promise, a vow made in the dark, a silent answer to her plea. "I will not take you." It said, "I will protect you." He pulled her gently against him, wrapping his arms around her as she trembled. She finally let her head rest against his chest, the steady, solid beat of his heart, a comfort in the terrifying emptiness. Shivering from the cold, from fear, and from emotions too deep and tangled to name, they held each other by the light of the small fire. Outside the cave, the wilderness was dark and full of danger. They both knew that the dawn would bring pursuit, that Harlan's rage would be scouring these very hills for them. But for now, in the fragile warmth of the cave, they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, two lost souls finding a momentary sanctuary in a world determined to destroy them. The manhunt began with the cold fury of a wronged king. Harlan Pike rode into Bitter Creek before noon the next day, the story of his tragedy already perfected. He did not appear as a coward who had fled a fire, but as a devastated husband whose home had been destroyed and whose wife had been stolen. He stormed into the sheriff's office, his face a mask of righteous anger, his powerful presence filling the small, dusty room. Sheriff Miller, a man who owed his position in no small part to Harlan's influence, listened with a grave and sympathetic expression. "He set the fire as a distraction." Harlan lied, his voice resonating with conviction. "The man is a devil. He has been poisoning my wife's mind for months. She has not been well. Her father's death took a toll on her senses. She is confused, suggestible. Dawson took advantage of her fragile state. This is not an elopement. Sheriff, this is a kidnapping. He has taken a madwoman into the wilderness, and God only knows what he intends to do with her." Harlan's narrative was a masterstroke of manipulation. He painted Eli as a dangerous predator and Clara as a helpless victim of her own broken mind. It was a story the patriarchal world of the West was primed to believe. A man's property had been stolen, and his unstable wife was part of the plunder. By branding Clara a madwoman, he stripped her of any agency, any credibility she might have had. Her testimony, should she ever have the chance to give it, was already dismissed. The law, embodied by Sheriff Miller, was firmly on Harlan's side. A posse of deputies and eager townsmen, lured by the promise of Pike's money and the thrill of the chase, was formed within the hour. They rode out under Harlan's grim direction, a pack of hounds led by a wolf, ready to hunt down the two fugitives. High in the canyons, where the wind carved strange shapes into the red rock, Clara and Eli were fighting a different kind of battle. Their world had shrunk to the basic, brutal necessities of survival. They moved by night, resting during the day in hidden crevices and under shadowy ledges, always listening, always watchful. Eli, with his years of solitary riding, knew the land. He knew how to read the tracks of animals, how to find hidden springs of water seeping from rock faces, and how to move without leaving a trace. He was their guide and their protector, his senses sharpened by the constant, looming threat of pursuit. The first few days were a blur of exhaustion and fear for Clara. She followed him numbly, her body aching, her mind still reeling from the fire and the flight. The wilderness was a harsh and unforgiving place. The sun beat down on them. The nights were bone-chillingly cold, and hunger was a constant, gnawing ache in her belly. They survived on the little Eli could hunt with snares, a rabbit, a brace of scrawny quail, and the handfuls of bitter berries and tough roots Clara learned to identify. It was a meager existence, a life stripped down to its rawest elements. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, something began to shift within her. The physical hardship, the clean, sharp air of the high country, the simple, focused rhythm of survival. It all began to scour away the layers of despair that had encrusted her soul. The constant fear was a terrible thing, but it was also a vital, living emotion. A world away from the dead, numb resignation she had felt in Harlan's house. Out here, she was not a possession. She was a survivor. Nights were long and cold. They would find shelter in a shallow cave or in the lee of a towering boulder, and Eli would build a small, carefully concealed fire. He would sit with his back to the rock, his rifle across his lap, watching the darkness while she slept. But she rarely slept through the night. She would wake and watch him, the firelight flickering across his bruised, weary face, and a feeling of profound, overwhelming gratitude would wash over her. This man was enduring this hardship for her. He was risking his life for her. One night, as they shared the last of a roasted rabbit, she began to talk. It started as a trickle, then became a flood. She told him stories from her childhood, things she thought she had long forgotten. She spoke of her mother, a kind, gentle woman who had taught her the names of wildflowers. She described the feeling of running barefoot through a freshly plowed field, the cool, damp earth beneath her feet. She remembered the sound of her own laughter, a sound so foreign to her now that the memory of it made her ache. "We had an old dog named Patches," she said, her voice soft in the firelight, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. He was a terrible hunting dog, afraid of his own shadow, but he would follow me everywhere. Once, I fell into Miller's pond, and he stood on the bank, barking his head off, until my father came and pulled me out. He was a coward, but he was a loyal coward. Eli listened as though each word were a sacred promise. He did not interrupt, did not offer platitudes. He simply listened, his gaze steady and warm. He was not just hearing her stories. He was bearing witness to the person she had been, the person who was slowly, tentatively, beginning to re-emerge from the wreckage of her life. In his quiet, attentive presence, Clara felt herself becoming whole again. The haunted girl was receding, and in her place was a woman with a past, a woman with a voice. The will to live, which she thought had been extinguished forever, was rekindling itself, fanned into a stubborn flame by his unwavering devotion. Their shared hardship and these quiet, firelit confessions forged a new, deeper intimacy between them. They began to dream. It was a dangerous, fragile thing. This dream, but it sustained them. "When we get through this," Eli said one evening, his voice a low rumble, "we could go north, to Montana. It is big country up there. A man and a woman could disappear, start fresh. No one would know us." The idea took root in Clara's heart. Montana. The name itself sounded like a promise of a new beginning. She could see it in her mind's eye, a small cabin by a river, smoke curling from the chimney, a life of peace and quiet work, a life with him, a life where she could be herself, where she could laugh again without fear. Their dream of escape became a silent covenant, a shared goal that gave purpose to their desperate flight. Their love, which had been born in silence and nurtured in shared sorrow, was no longer unspoken. It was in every look they exchanged, every time his hand brushed hers as he passed her a piece of food, every night she woke to find him watching over her. It was a fierce, protective love, a desperate tenderness that had grown in the harshest of soils. But this love, their greatest strength, was also their greatest danger. It was the reason they were being hunted. It was the crime for which the world would never forgive them. One evening, they found a high, sheltered ledge, a natural balcony overlooking a vast, empty expanse of red cliffs and deep purple canyons. A storm was building in the distance, miles away, and flashes of silent lightning illuminated the horizon, backlighting the clouds in spectacular, fleeting bursts of silver. The air was charged with a strange, electric energy. They had a little food, they had water, and for the moment, they were safe. They sat together, watching the distant storm, shoulder to shoulder. The feeling between them was so powerful, so undeniable, that it was a physical presence in the air around them. This life on the run, this constant dance with death, had stripped away all pretense, all artifice. All that was left was the raw, elemental truth of what they had become to each other. Clara turned to him, her eyes shining in the dim light. "Eli," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she could no longer contain. He turned to face her, and in his eyes, she saw her own longing, her own fear, her own desperate, impossible love reflected back at her. He raised a hand, his calloused fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. There were no more words to be said. Beneath the towering red cliffs, with the silent lightning flashing like a celestial announcement on the horizon, they came together. It was not an act of lust, but an act of desperate tenderness, of profound and sorrowful beauty. It was a final, defiant affirmation of life in the face of death. It was two broken souls clinging to each other, finding a moment of perfect, incandescent grace in a world that had offered them none. It was a claiming, a healing, a promise that, for this one night, they were not fugitives. They were just a man and a woman, and they were alive. The next morning, they awoke in each other's arms as the sun cast its first pale golden light across the canyons. For a single, beautiful moment, the world was peaceful. The dream of Montana felt real, almost within their grasp. Then the world shattered. The sound of a dislodged rock, the sharp, unmistakable click of a rifle hammer being pulled back, the harsh shout of a man's voice. "They are here!" They scrambled to their feet, their moment of peace instantly annihilated. The posse was upon them. Men were swarming up the rocks from three sides, their faces grim, their rifles leveled. They were trapped. Eli reacted instantly, pushing Clara behind him, his own pistol suddenly in his hand. "Get back!" he yelled at the men, his voice a desperate snarl. "She is with me by her own choice." But his words were lost in the chaos. Harlan Pike appeared at the top of the ledge, his face a triumphant, demonic mask. "Kidnapper!" he roared. "Thief!" A shot rang out, not from Harlan, but from one of the deputies on the flank. Eli cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain, and staggered back, clutching his shoulder. A dark red stain bloomed across the fabric of his shirt. Clara screamed his name, a raw animal sound of pure terror and rage. She rushed toward him, but rough hands grabbed her, pulling her back. She fought like a wildcat, kicking and scratching. Her world narrowed to the sight of Eli, wounded and trying to stay on his feet, his pistol now useless in his trembling hand.
Eli!
She screamed again as they dragged her away from him. Men overwhelmed him, knocking the gun from his hand and forcing him to his knees. Harlan strode over to him, a cruel, satisfied smirk on his face.
I told you I would kill you,
he sneered. But the sheriff intervened. He will stand trial, Pike, Miller said, his voice firm. We will do this by the book. Clara was dragged, screaming and sobbing, back toward the horses. They tied her hands, treating her not as a victim to be rescued, but as a prisoner to be contained. She watched, helpless, as they hauled a pale, bleeding Eli to his feet and bound him as well. The journey back to Bitter Creek was an exercise in public humiliation. Harlan paraded her through the center of town, her hands bound, her face streaked with dirt and tears. He held her arm in a bruising grip, declaring to the gawking townspeople who had gathered to watch the spectacle, "Here is my poor, mad wife, saved from the clutches of the villain who took her. She is not well. As you can see, she will be cared for." The whispers followed her, a wave of pity and condemnation. They saw her wild, desperate eyes, her disheveled appearance, and they nodded, accepting Harlan's story. She was a disgrace, a madwoman. They threw Eli, weak from blood loss, into the dark, stifling confines of the sheriff's barn to await his trial. A doctor was sent to patch his wound, but it was a cursory, uncaring treatment. His fate was all but sealed. Clara was taken back to the house on the hill, her true prison, and locked in her room. The door was bolted from the outside. She was alone again, separated from the only person who had ever seen her, the only man she had ever loved, who was now set to hang for his crime of saving her. The world had once again shrunk to the size of a single room, but this prison was crueler than the first. The window was boarded over, leaving only thin cracks through which the indifferent daylight could seep. The door was not only locked but bolted from the outside, a heavy, final sound that echoed the closing of a coffin lid. Mrs. Gable was her jailer, a silent, grim-faced warden who brought her meals on a tray and watched her with cold, unforgiving eyes. Clara was a pariah in her own home, a disgraced object to be hidden away until the scandal passed. Harlan, in contrast, seemed to thrive on the ordeal. He had regained his status as the wronged husband, the powerful patriarch who had rightfully reclaimed his property. He would sit at the head of the long, empty dining table, forcing Clara to eat with him, and he would talk of Eli's fate with a chilling, casual cruelty. "Sheriff Miller tells me the circuit judge is a hard man," he said one evening, cutting into a thick steak while Clara stared at her untouched plate. "He has a fondness for the gallows, especially for kidnappers and horse thieves. I suppose they will call it kidnapping. It sounds so much more definitive than alienation of affection." He looked up at her, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. "Do you think he will be brave on the day, Clara? Or do you think he will weep for his pathetic, wasted life?" She did not answer. She had learned that silence was her only shield, a thin, brittle defense against his verbal assaults. Inside, his words were like shards of glass, twisting in a wound that would not heal. The image of Eli, pale and bleeding, being dragged away, was a constant torment. The thought of a rope around his neck was a horror she could not allow her mind to fully entertain, for fear it would shatter her completely. In town, Sheriff Benjamin Miller sat in his office, cleaning a Colt revolver that did not need cleaning. He and Eli Dawson had not been close friends, but they had been friends nonetheless. They had ridden together on a cattle drive to Cheyenne 5 years prior, a long, hard journey that had forged a bond of mutual respect. He knew Eli to be a quiet, honorable man, a man who carried a deep sadness but not an ounce of malice. He did not believe for a second that Eli was a kidnapper. He had seen the look in Clara Pike's eyes, the desperation of a trapped animal, not a madwoman. But he also knew Harlan Pike. He knew the man's power, the way his money and influence were woven into the very fabric of Bitter Creek. To defy Harlan was to commit professional suicide. And likely worse, Miller had a wife and 2 young daughters to think about. He was caught in the jaws of a trap, his conscience on one side, his duty and his family's safety on the other. So he did his job. He kept Eli locked in the barn. He took Harlan's statement, and he tried to ignore the sick, heavy feeling in the pit of his stomach. Desperation gave Clara a strength she did not know she possessed. She began to watch, to listen, to learn the rhythms of her prison. She learned that Mrs. Gable locked the bolt and then retired to her own small room at the back of the house. She learned that the new ranch hand hired to replace Eli was a heavy sleeper who patrolled the grounds only once, an hour after midnight. And she discovered that the boards on her window, nailed in haste, were loose on one side, night after night. She worked at them with the handle of a silver spoon she had hidden from her dinner tray, twisting and prying with a silent, patient determination. Finally, one of the boards gave way with a soft crack, creating a gap just wide enough for her to squeeze through. That night, she waited until the house was utterly silent, until she heard the distant clock in the hall chime 2. She slipped out of the window, her bare feet landing softly on the dirt below. Dressed in dark clothes, she moved like a shadow, keeping to the darkest parts of the yard, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The half-mile walk to town along the dark, empty road was a journey of sheer terror. Every rustle in the grass a potential threat, every hoot of an owl a warning. The sheriff's barn was a dark, hulking shape at the edge of town. A single deputy sat on a chair by the main door, his head slumped onto his chest, fast asleep. Clara crept around to the back, to the small, barred window of the stall that served as a makeshift cell. She pressed her face close, her breath fogging in the cold night air. "Eli?" she whispered, her voice a dry, trembling sound. For a moment, there was no answer. Then, a shape shifted in the darkness within. He moved to the window, his face a pale oval in the faint starlight. "Clara!" he breathed, his voice rough with disbelief. "My God, you should not be here. It is too dangerous." "I had to see you," she said, her fingers finding the cold iron bars. His own hand came up to meet hers, his fingers lacing through hers in the small gap between the bars. His touch was a jolt of life, a warmth that spread through her entire body. It was the first kind touch she had felt since they were torn apart. "Your shoulder?" she asked, her voice thick with concern. "It will heal," he said. "Clara, what has he done to you? Are you safe?" "He has locked me away," she admitted. "But I am not hurt, not like you." They stood like that for a long time, their hands clasped through the bars, speaking in hushed whispers. They did not talk of the trial or the hanging. Instead, they talked of the stars, which were scattered across the Wyoming sky in a brilliant, silent multitude. "Do you remember what you said?" she asked him. "About freedom feeling like something you can only see, but never hold." She looked up at the vast, star-dusted heavens. "They are beautiful tonight, but they feel so far away. They are just waiting for us." "Clara," he said, his voice low and steady, though she could feel a tremor in the hand that held hers. "Somewhere past all this." His calmness in the face of his own doom was more than she could bear. "Eli, you have to fight this," she pleaded. "Tell them the truth. Tell them what he is." A sad, weary smile touched his lips, a ghostly expression in the darkness. And who would they believe? A penniless cowboy or the man who owns half their world? My word against his is worth less than nothing, and he has already painted you as a madwoman. Your testimony would only be used to hang me faster. He squeezed her hand, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "That is why you have to go, before the trial. You have to run, Clara, run north, like we planned. Go to Montana, live for both of us." Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent.
No.
She whispered back, her voice fierce. I will not abandon you. We are in this together. Whatever happens, we face it together. Her refusal was a testament to how much she had changed. The frightened, broken girl had been forged into a woman of unyielding resolve. She would not run and leave him to his fate. Her love was not a thing of convenience. It was a thing of substance, a bond that could not be broken by prison bars or the threat of death. She visited him twice more, 2 more terrifying, secret journeys in the dead of night. Their whispered conversations were a lifeline, a desperate affirmation of their connection in a world set on destroying them. Each time, he begged her to flee, and each time, she refused. On her last visit, the night before the trial, the air was still and strangely warm, charged with an unsettling energy. A storm is coming, he murmured, his eyes on the sky. I will be there tomorrow, she promised. In the courtroom, I do not know what I will do, but I will be there.
Clara, no,
he pleaded, but she was already melting back into the darkness, a resolute shadow on a desperate mission. The morning of the trial. The sky was a strange, sickly yellow. The air was thick and heavy, and an ominous silence had fallen over the land. By the time the proceedings began in the small, overcrowded courthouse, the wind had begun to rise, howling around the corners of the building and rattling the window panes. A sandstorm was sweeping in from the plains. The courtroom was a sea of grim, male faces. Harlan sat at the front, the picture of a respectable, aggrieved husband. Eli stood beside Sheriff Miller, his arm in a sling, his face pale but his expression calm. He did not look at Harlan. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a face he knew he would not, and should not, find. The trial was a farce from the beginning. Harlan's lawyer painted Eli as a manipulative drifter who had preyed on a vulnerable woman. Harlan himself gave a masterful performance on the witness stand, his voice full of sorrow as he described his wife's deteriorating mental state and Dawson's sinister influence. He spoke of the fire, the kidnapping, and his heroic efforts to save his beloved, unstable wife. The men in the room nodded, their expressions a mixture of sympathy for him and contempt for the man who had violated the sanctity of his home. As the wind shrieked outside, whipping sand and dust against the windows until the room was cast in a gloomy, twilight haze, the judge prepared to give his summary. It was clear to everyone which way the verdict would fall. Then, the main doors of the courthouse burst open with a violent crash. Clara stood silhouetted against the swirling, dusty yellow light from outside. The wind tore at her dress and whipped her hair across her face. She looked like a prophetess, a fury born of the storm itself. All heads turned. A collective gasp went through the room. Harlan shot to his feet, his face contorted with rage.
Clara, what is the meaning of this? Get her out of here. She is unwell,
he shouted to the sheriff. But Clara strode into the room, her eyes blazing, fixed on the stunned face of the judge.
No,
she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing out over the howl of the wind. I am not unwell. I am a witness. She walked to the front of the courtroom, planting herself directly in front of the judge's bench, defying all convention, all rules of decorum. My name is Clara May Thompson, she declared, pointedly refusing to use her married name. I was not kidnapped. I fled. I fled from a man who bought me from my father to settle a debt. I fled from a man who treated me not as a wife, but as a slave. I fled from his cruelty and his violence. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. She turned her fiery gaze on Harlan. This man is not a victim. He is a monster. He left a boy to die in a fire while he saved himself. She then turned her eyes to Eli, and her expression softened, her voice filling with an unshakable conviction. Eli Dawson is not a kidnapper. He is a hero. He saved that boy's life, and he saved mine. He is the only person in this valley who has shown me an ounce of kindness, The only crime he is guilty of is seeing my suffering and being brave enough not to look away. Her testimony, so raw and powerful, hung in the dusty, silent air. For a moment, she had broken the spell of Harlan's lies. She had spoken the truth. Eli watched her, a look of profound love and deep sorrow on his face. He had tried to protect her from this, but he could not deny the fierce pride he felt seeing her stand there, a warrior in her own right. The judge, a stern man with a face like withered leather, recovered from his shock. He looked down at her not with consideration, but with a deep-seated, patronizing disapproval. "Mrs. Pike," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "we have already heard testimony regarding your delicate emotional state. Grief can do terrible things to the female mind." "I am not grieving, and my mind is sound," she retorted, her chin high. "I am telling you the truth." The judge scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound. He looked at Harlan, who gave a slight, sorrowful shake of his head, as if to say, "You see what I have to endure?" The men of the jury exchanged knowing glances. They saw a hysterical woman, a wife defying her husband in public, and they were deaf to the truth of her words. In the patriarchal West, her testimony was not just shocking, it was an aberration, a disruption of the natural order of things, and it was summarily mocked and dismissed. "The testimony of a confused and overwrought woman cannot be considered evidence," the judge declared, his voice booming with finality. He turned his attention to Eli. "Eli Dawson, this court finds you guilty of the kidnapping of Mrs. Clara Pike and the arson of the Double Horn Ranch property." The words were like a hammer blow. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. "No," she breathed. The judge looked down at Eli, his expression hard as granite. "For these crimes, you are hereby sentenced to be hanged by the neck until you are dead. The sentence will be carried out in 3 days' time, at dawn." As two deputies moved to take Eli away, his eyes found Clara's one last time. He did not look defeated. He looked at her with a love that transcended the verdict, the room, the world itself. "Eli!" she screamed, a sound of such pure, unadulterated agony that it silenced the wind itself for a heartbeat. The name was torn from the very depths of her soul. Her strength finally gave out. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of dust and despair. As the deputies led Eli from the room, Clara's legs buckled beneath her. She collapsed to the hard wooden floor, a crumpled, broken figure, as the sandstorm raged outside, turning the sky and her world to dust. The 2 days that followed the trial were a season in hell. Harlan brought Clara back to the ranch, not to her boarded-up room, but to their shared one. It was his final act of ownership, forcing her to lie in the bed of the man who was sending her love to the gallows. He did not touch her. He did not have to. His presence was a violation more profound than any physical act. He was a victor, displaying his spoils, and she was the ultimate prize. Clara became a ghost. The fire that had blazed in her during the trial had been extinguished, leaving behind only cold, gray ash. She moved through the house when ordered, a silent, pale automaton with eyes that saw nothing. Her heart, which had beat with such frantic life in the canyons, was a dead, heavy thing in her chest. She ate nothing. She barely slept. She was simply waiting for the sound of the hammer building the gallows in town, waiting for the final, soul-crushing dawn. She was already dead. Her body was just waiting for the news. Harlan told her the news himself on the second evening, with the same casual cruelty he had displayed before. "They have finished the preparations," he announced as he sat across from her at the dinner table. "The hanging will be at sunrise. Miller is bringing in an extra dozen deputies to manage the crowd. It seems the whole valley wants to see your cowboy swing." His words were meant to be the final turn of the knife, but he had misjudged her. He thought her spirit was broken, but he did not understand that when you burn a thing down to its very foundation, what is left is not ash, but stone. His confirmation of the time, the finality of that single word, dawn, did not shatter her further. It galvanized her. In the deepest, most silent chamber of her broken heart, a single, cold spark ignited. If she could not live with Eli, then she would die with him, but they would not be a spectacle for Harlan Pike's amusement. She would not let him have that victory. A terrible, crystalline clarity descended upon her. She finally knew what she had to do. That night, she feigned sleep, her breathing even and slow, until she heard the deep, rumbling snores that signaled Harlan was truly unconscious. Then, she slipped from the bed, a wraith in the moonlight. She knew where he kept it. In his study, behind a heavy book on cattle breeds, was a hidden safe. She had seen him open it once, her fingers, numb and clumsy with cold, fumbled with the dial. She did not know the combination, but desperation was its own key. Using the butt of a heavy letter opener, she pried and worked at the hinge with a frantic, silent strength. The metal groaned in protest, and then, with a soft crack, the small door gave way. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was a pearl-handled revolver. It was heavy and cold in her hand, a solid piece of undeniable reality. She did not take a traveling cloak or sensible clothes. She went to the old chest at the foot of the bed and pulled out the dress she had been married in. It was a simple, plain thing, her only connection to a life before Harlan. During their flight, it had been torn at the hem and stained with the smoke of the fire. It was the garment of her subjugation, the symbol of her sail. Tonight, it would be her battle standard. She put it on, the familiar fabric a strange comfort and a stark reminder. She was no longer a bride being sold, but a widow claiming her dead. With the revolver tucked into a sash at her waist, she crept from the house. She saddled a horse in the darkness, her movements swift and sure. She rode not like a frightened girl, but like an avenging angel, the torn hem of her wedding dress flying behind her like a tattered flag in the wind. Bitter Creek was dark and silent, save for the nervous energy that seemed to hum beneath the surface. The gallows, a stark and ugly skeleton of new-cut timber, stood in the center of the town square, a grim promise of the morning to come. Clara rode straight to the sheriff's office. A single lamp burned inside. She dismounted, her heart a cold, steady drum, and pushed the door open. Sheriff Miller was sitting at his desk, a bottle of whiskey and a single glass before him. He looked up, his eyes widening in shock when he saw her standing there, a ghost in a wedding dress with the cold fire of resolve in her eyes. "Mrs. Pike," he stammered, getting to his feet. "What are you doing here? You cannot be here." "I have come for him," she said, her voice low and steady, without a trace of the hysteria he had been trained to expect. "Now, you listen to me," he started, his hand moving toward the gun on his hip. "You need to go back to your husband. There is nothing you can do." In a single, fluid motion, she pulled Harlan's revolver from her sash and leveled it at his chest. The sheriff froze, his hand hovering over his own weapon. He saw the look in her eyes. It was not the look of a madwoman. It was the look of someone who had already lost everything, and that made her the most dangerous person he had ever faced. "I am not asking you, Sheriff," she said, her voice as cold and hard as the barrel of the gun she held. "I am not here to negotiate. You will give me the key to the barn, and you will turn your back, or so help me God. My husband will be needing a new sheriff come morning." Miller looked from the unwavering gun to her implacable face. He saw the truth of her threat. He saw the culmination of his own compromised morality. He had known Eli was a good man. He had let himself be bullied by a rich tyrant, and now this half-broken girl was calling him to account. With a heavy, defeated sigh, he slowly unhooked a large iron key from his belt and tossed it onto the desk. "The deputy out front is a sound sleeper," he said quietly, turning his back to her and pouring himself a drink. "You have maybe 5 minutes." Clara snatched the key and ran. She found the deputy just as the sheriff had said, slumped in his chair, dead to the world. She moved past him to the large, padlocked door of the barn. Her hands trembled as she fit the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, grating sound. She slid the bolt free and pulled the heavy door open just enough to slip inside. It was dark, the air thick with the smell of hay and animal sweat. "Eli?" she whispered into the blackness. He was there in an instant, a dark shape moving toward the bars of his stall.
"Clara!"
His voice was a raw mix of hope and terror.
"What have you done?"
She reached the cell, fumbling with the lock, the key scraping against the iron. Tears she did not know she had left to cry began streaming down her face, hot against her cold skin. The lock clicked open. She pushed the gate wide and threw herself into his arms. He held her tight, his one good arm wrapping around her as if he could absorb her into himself. "You have to go," he breathed into her hair. "Take the horse and ride. Do not do this." She pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his face. "Listen to me," she whispered, her voice fierce and absolute, a vow spoken in the heart of the gallows shadow. "There is no life for me without you. There is no Montana. There is only this. If you die, I die too." He looked at her, and, in the faint light, he saw the unshakable truth of her words. He would not be able to persuade her otherwise. Their fates were intertwined, for better or for worse. Until the very end, he nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "Together, then," he said. They fled. He took the deputy's gun, and they found her horse tethered where she had left it. They mounted together, Clara in front, Eli's arms around her, and rode out of Bitter Creek just as the first man, woken by the sounds, shouted the alarm. They plunged into the desert, the rising wind of an approaching storm at their backs, whipping Clara's torn dress around them, behind them. The sounds of shouting grew, followed by the thunder of pursuing hoofbeats. Harlan Pike, woken with the news, was leading the chase, his fury incandescent. They rode with the desperate speed of the damned, the storm gathering around them. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the stark, alien landscape of the desert in jagged flashes. The wind howled, kicking up sand that stung their faces and obscured the trail. The posse was relentless, a pack of hounds closing in. At sunrise, the precise moment he was to have been hanged, they reached the cliffs. They were at the high canyon, the very ledge where they had found their one night of peace, their one moment of grace. But there was no sanctuary here now. It was a trap. The cliffs fell away on three sides, and the path they had taken was now blocked by Harlan and his riders. They dismounted, their horse panting and trembling. They were surrounded. Harlan rode to the forefront, his face a mask of pure hatred.
"It ends here.
Dawson!" he screamed over the wind.
"You will not have her."
Eli stood his ground, pulling Clara close behind him, shielding her with his body. He raised his pistol, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. He held her close, his back to the abyss, the storm raging around them. She looked up at his face, seeing no fear, only a deep, sorrowful love. The end had come. She pressed her face into his chest, her voice a final, ragged whisper against the storm. "Take me instead," she said, the words a release, a final prayer. "I do not care anymore." A single sharp gunshot echoed through the canyon, momentarily louder than the wind. It was not Eli who fell, it was not Clara. Harlan Pike jerked in his saddle, a look of profound shock on his face. A dark, blossoming stain appeared on his chest. He swayed for a moment, his eyes wide with disbelief, and then he tumbled from his horse, landing in a heap on the rocky ground, dead. A stunned silence fell over the posse. The deputies lowered their weapons, their eyes darting from Harlan's body to the two figures on the edge of the cliff. Who had fired? Was it Eli, with his one remaining shot? Was it the girl, with the revolver they now saw clutched in her hand? Or had it been one of their own, A man whose conscience had finally outweighed his fear. No one knew. No one would ever know for sure. In that moment of hesitation, of confusion, the storm unleashed its full fury. The wind shrieked, and a thick, impenetrable sheet of sand and rain swept across the cliff top, completely obscuring everything from view. When the gust passed a few seconds later and the men could see again, the ledge was empty. The lovers were gone. They had disappeared into the storm, as if swallowed by the very land itself. They were never seen again in Bitter Creek. The posse searched, but they found no tracks, no sign. It was as if they had vanished from the face of the earth. But in the years that followed, stories began to be told, travelers riding through the remote northern territories, near the Montana border, would sometimes speak of a small, hidden cabin in a valley by a winding river. They spoke of seeing smoke curling from its chimney in the deep of winter. Some even claimed to have caught a glimpse, from a distance, of two figures standing by a firelight in the evenings. A tall man with a slight limp and a woman with hair the color of corn silk. They were just stories, of course, whispers on the wind. But they were enough to become a legend, proof that love, though scarred by tragedy and forged in the harshest of fires, had found a way to endure, beyond judgment, beyond the law, and beyond time. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.